The bright white light of the hospital room blinded Luke the moment he opened his eyes. For an instant, everything seemed out of focus, as if he were seeing the world for the first time. A low buzzing sound filled his head, and he tried to move his hands, but they felt impossibly heavy. He felt trapped in a body he didn't recognize. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his lips cracked. A soft voice came from his side. "Lucas? Can you hear me?" He blinked, trying to adjust to the light and the sounds around him. When he finally managed to distinguish the shapes in front of him, he saw a woman. She was sitting by the bed, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen as though she hadn't slept in days. She held his hand tightly, as if afraid he might vanish. "Who are you?" Luke murmured, his throat tight. The woman gasped, and for a moment, the pain in her eyes was almost tangible. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him, as if trying to process the weight of his question. Finally, she swallowed hard. "It's me, Mariana, your fiancé." The words echoed in Lucas's mind. "Fiancé?" He blinked again, searching for some spark of memory, some feeling that connected this woman to his heart, but there was nothing but a void. He studied her face, desperate to grasp onto something familiar, but all he felt was an overwhelming sense of disconnection. Before he could ask anything else, a doctor walked into the room. He was a tall man with glasses and a serious expression, who gestured for Emma to step out for a few minutes. Luke felt a wave of relief as she let go of his hand and left the room, but that relief quickly turned to apprehension as the doctor spoke. "Lucas, you were in a serious accident. You suffered a traumatic brain injury, and as a result, you've lost part of your memory." The words hit him like an avalanche. His mind, already overwhelmed with confusion, now spun in circles, trying to absorb what he'd just been told. "How long have I been here?" Luke asked hesitantly. "You've been in a coma for almost 3 weeks, the doctor explained, his tone steady but devoid of false hope. "Your recovery was complicated, but the worst is over. However, the amnesia may take some time to resolve, or in some cases, it might never fully resolve." Luke didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to fight against this reality, to refuse to believe that he couldn't remember his own life. Another part felt resigned, accepting the emptiness that now dominated his mind. When the doctor left, Emma returned to the room, her eyes filled with anticipation, hoping he would say something comforting. But the silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know who this woman was or even who he himself was. The discomfort inside him grew with every passing second. Emma tried to break the silence. "We'll go home tomorrow," she said with a forced smile. "The doctor thinks it might help." The concept felt as foreign to him as everything else. Luke just nodded, unable to form a response. That night, Luke stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind wandered to places he couldn't identify, and the emptiness within him only grew. Somewhere out there was a life waiting for him, a life he didn't recognize. The only thing he knew for certain was that, somehow, he no longer belonged to it. The next day, Luke felt a mix of relief and apprehension as he left the hospital. Emma guided him carefully to the car, watching his every move as if handling something fragile. The drive home was quiet. Emma focused on the road, while Luke tried to take in the city, the streets, and the buildings, hoping something would spark a memory. But everything felt distant, like he was in an unfamiliar place. When they arrived at the house, Emma smiled, though her expression seemed strained. "Welcome back," she said, holding the door open for him. Luke stepped inside hesitantly. The house was spacious and modern, furnished with what looked like expensive pieces. He walked slowly through the living room, observing everything with the curiosity of a guest, not someone who was supposed to be coming home. The silence between them deepened as Emma followed closely behind, waiting for any reaction from him. "Does any of this look familiar?" she finally asked. Luke shook his head. Nothing did. The photos on the walls showed a smiling couple embracing in various exotic locations, him and Mariana, apparently, but those images brought him no sense of recognition. He didn't see himself in those photos, nor could he remember any of the happy moments they seemed to represent. Emma sighed. The doctor said it might take time. Maybe if you go back to your routine, things will start to come back. He nodded but had no idea what his routine even meant. Everything felt so surreal. He decided to go to the bedroom, hoping that being surrounded by his personal belongings might trigger something. However, as he stepped into the room, the sense of disconnect only deepened. There were clothes, objects, and furniture, but none of it felt like it belonged to him. As he explored the wardrobe, Luke found a suit hanging neatly inside. It was expensive, elegant, with a flawless cut. He took it off the hanger and studied it for a few moments. It was part of his previous life, part of the man he used to be, but he couldn't picture himself wearing something like that. The bedroom door opened, and Emma walked in carrying a box. "I thought this might help," she said, placing the box on the bed. "It's full of photos and keepsakes we've collected over the years." Luke approached the bed and, with hesitation, began sifting through the box. Inside, he found travel tickets, event stubs, cards, and a few old letters. Everything seemed to belong to a life he didn't feel a part of. He picked up a letter and unfolded it. It was a birthday note from Mariana, filled with sweet words and promises of eternal love. But the words didn't resonate with him. They felt like they were written by a stranger. "I'm sorry," he murmured, unsure of how to explain what he was feeling. Emma sat down beside him, trying to keep her composure. "It's okay. I know this is hard." But the discomfort in the room was tangible. Luke didn't know how to respond. He didn't know how to meet Mariana's expectations, and the emptiness inside him seemed to grow with every object or photo he touched. It was as if he were living someone else's life. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Luke got out of bed and began wandering through the house. He opened drawers, looked through documents, and tried to absorb as much information as he could about who he was. But the more he searched, the more lost he felt. One drawer in the office caught his attention. Inside, there was a bundle of old letters tied together with a ribbon. Luke picked them up and started reading one by one. At first, they were mundane, but as he read further, one letter made him stop. It was from someone named Thomas, written with an urgent tone and an unsettling familiarity. It didn't explicitly detail the nature of their business, but there were references to meetings and important negotiations that Luke felt he should remember. The letter's cold and calculated language made him uneasy. There was something dark behind those words, as if a buried truth he didn't want to face was staring back at him. He carefully placed the letter back and closed the drawer, his heart pounding. Who was Thomas? And why did that letter leave him so unsettled? When Luke returned to the bedroom, he lay down next to Mariana, who slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He closed his eyes, but sleep eluded him. The feeling that there was so much more to uncover about his past consumed him. He wasn't just a man who had lost his memory. There were dark secrets in his past, and he wasn't ready to confront them. In the days that followed, Luke tried to adjust to his new reality, but the nagging sense of incompleteness continued to haunt him. Emma did her best to help him get back into a routine, but her efforts, though well-meaning, only emphasized how disconnected he felt from his old life. That was when Emma suggested he meet Anna, an old friend with whom he had lost touch in recent years. Perhaps, she hoped, seeing someone outside their immediate circle might spark something in Lucas. On the afternoon of the meeting, they went to a cafe downtown. Emma stayed home, giving Luke and Anna space to talk alone. Luke waited at a table, observing his surroundings. The cafe felt familiar, but nothing in his memory connected him to the place. When Anna arrived, it was impossible not to notice her hesitation. She paused for a moment at the door, watching Luke from a distance before approaching. Her expression was guarded, as though she were trying to mask her emotions. When she finally sat down, The tension between them was almost tangible. "It's strange seeing you like this," she said bluntly. Luke looked at her, trying to find some spark of recognition in his own gaze, but there was nothing. He managed a half smile. "I imagine it is. The truth is, I don't remember you." Anna nodded but seemed uneasy. She fidgeted with the coffee cup in front of her, avoiding eye contact. "I heard about your accident," she began. "Emma told me you lost your memory." Luke nodded. He sensed there was more to Anna's words, but she seemed reluctant to continue. The silence that followed was heavy, as if they were both tiptoeing around something neither wanted to address. "I don't know exactly what you've heard," Luke said, breaking the silence, "but it seems I wasn't the easiest person to deal with before all this." Anna studied him for a moment, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite identify, pain, perhaps, or mistrust. Then she finally spoke. "You've changed a lot in the past few years. You weren't always like this, but things got complicated." "Complicated how?" Luke asked, genuinely confused. Anna hesitated again, as if carefully choosing her words. "You distanced yourself from a lot of people. Made choices that..." She trailed off, staring into her coffee as though the answer might be floating inside it. "I don't know if I can explain it, Lucas. Maybe it's something you need to figure out on your own." Anna's discomfort was palpable, but Luke felt an increasing need to know more. He didn't want to rely solely on what others told him. He needed to understand for himself. Yet Anna seemed closed off, distant, and he knew she wouldn't offer him much more. The conversation ended without major revelations, but one thing became clear to Lucas. He had changed drastically before the accident, and that change was not something he could be proud of. Anna left the cafe hurriedly, almost as if she were escaping the encounter. Luke stayed behind for a few more minutes, digesting the conversation. Anna hadn't told him everything, but her words echoed in his mind. He had made choices, pushed people away. Whatever those choices were, they were still following him, even now when he couldn't remember any of it. When Luke returned home, Emma asked how the meeting had gone. He merely shrugged, unwilling to go into detail. Something inside him told him the past he was beginning to uncover would be painful, and he wasn't ready to face that truth, not yet. The following days were marked by a growing restlessness. His conversation with Anna had planted a deep seed of doubt in Lucas's mind, as if there was something dark waiting to be unearthed. He tried to follow the routine Emma had organized. Small daily activities, she said, were part of his old life, but none of it made sense. Every task, every object around him only reinforced the feeling that he no longer belonged to that world. The frustration was building. Luke knew he needed answers and that they wouldn't simply come to him. That night, while Emma slept, he got out of bed, determined to search for answers on his own. The silence of the house was oppressive. He went to the office, where he had found the letters a few days earlier. He felt certain that room held something important. Luke began rummaging through the drawers, opening and closing files, contracts, and documents, hoping to find a clue that would help him understand who he had been before the accident. That was when he found what looked like a confidential file with his name on the cover. Inside was a series of documents detailing investments, business meetings, and contracts, many of them written in cold, technical language. In the middle of the file, one letter stood out. He vaguely remembered seeing it before, but this time, the name at the bottom made him pause. The name echoed in his mind as something significant, something he should remember. The letter wasn't long but mentioned a recent meeting and the need to finalize a negotiation. The tone was direct, almost impersonal, but Luke felt a wave of unease as he read the words. He read the letter again, trying to uncover hidden details between the lines. References to important negotiations and pending agreements made it clear he had been involved in something much larger than an ordinary business venture. There was an urgency to it, and, behind that, a sense of danger Luke couldn't ignore. One question grew in his mind. Who was Thomas, And why did he seem so relevant to everything that was happening? Luke put the documents away and continued searching for more clues. He felt like he was getting closer to uncovering something crucial, but there were still missing pieces to the puzzle. He opened another drawer and found a laptop. The machine looked old but still functional. There was a password, but, to his surprise, his fingers instinctively typed a combination he didn't consciously remember. The laptop unlocked, revealing a series of old emails. He began scrolling through them, most of which were related to business and professional contacts. But then one email exchange stopped him in his tracks. The sender was, once again, Thomas, and this message, more than the others, revealed the gravity of the situation. "We need to wrap this up quickly. We're out of time. They're applying pressure, and any mistake could be fatal for all of us." Lucas's heart raced. Who were they? And what was being finalized in such a hurry? The feeling that he was entangled in something dangerous grew stronger with every new piece of information he uncovered. He continued reading the emails and realized many of the exchanges between him and Thomas were cryptic, filled with indirect references to meetings and locations. With each new message, the tone became more tense, as if they were both being pushed by a greater force. Luke closed the laptop, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was more than just a case of lost memory. He had been involved in dangerous dealings, and his accident no longer seemed like a mere coincidence. The truth was closer than he had imagined, but it was terrifying. The man he was beginning to uncover was not someone he liked. On the contrary, he was starting to realize that his past was stained by bad choices and dangerous alliances. When he returned to bed, Luke couldn't stop thinking about the documents, the letters, and the emails. Thomas wasn't just an old friend or business partner. He was someone directly tied to who Luke had become before the accident, and the choices they had made together carried heavy consequences. Now, Luke was caught between two worlds: the new life he was trying to build and the old one that refused to disappear. Emma continued to sleep peacefully beside him, oblivious to the storm brewing in Lucas's mind. He knew he would have to confront her soon, but not yet. There was still so much left to uncover, and he couldn't share any of it with anyone until he understood the full truth. There were more secrets buried, and Luke was determined to unearth them, even if it meant losing everything he had left. The next morning, Luke woke up with his mind still caught in the discoveries of the previous night. The letters, the emails, the name Thomas, they all hammered at his thoughts like loose pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble. But something inside him told him he was close to an important revelation, and he couldn't stop now. Emma left early, saying she was going to visit her mother. This gave Luke the perfect opportunity to continue his investigation. He knew he needed to find out more about Thomas, what they had been involved in, and, most importantly, what it all had to do with the accident. Determined not to wait for the answers to come to him, Luke made a bold decision. In an attempt to confront his past head-on, he went to the address mentioned in one of the more recent emails he had found the night before. It was an old commercial building downtown, seemingly harmless, but with an air of something clandestine. As he stepped inside, a wave of déjà vu washed over him. The walls, the smell of the place, even the worn-out furniture gave him an unsettling sense of familiarity. He went straight to the third floor, as indicated in Thomas's email. The space was empty, save for a single door at the end of the hallway, behind which muffled voices could be heard. Luke hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, but something deep inside pushed him to move forward. When he opened the door, he was met by a middle-aged man with a hard, penetrating gaze. Luke knew instinctively that this was Thomas, even if he couldn't remember the specifics of his appearance. The recognition was buried somewhere in the depths of his mind. "So, you came back after all," Thomas said, his voice dripping with irony. Luke closed the door behind him, trying to stay calm despite the chaos in his mind. "I don't remember you," Luke began bluntly, "but I need to understand what's going on. What were we doing?" Why were you so desperate in those emails? Thomas eyed him warily, crossing his arms. You don't remember me? But you came here? He shook his head, clearly skeptical. You've always been smarter than this, Lucas. Don't you think it's a bit late to play innocent? I'm telling the truth, Luke insisted, feeling the tension in the room rise. I lost my memory in the accident. I don't know who I am anymore, and I have no idea what you and I were involved in. Thomas laughed, but it was devoid of humor. The dry sound echoed through the small office. You lost your memory, but your problems remain the same, Lucas. You were about to betray us. Do you think I don't know that? Those words hit Luke like a punch to the gut. Betray us? He tried to process what Thomas had said, but he couldn't remember any plan of betrayal. Yet, as the conversation unfolded, something inside him began to align. The growing fear he felt, the tension in the letters, the urgency in the emails. There was a reason for all of it. Betray you? Luke asked, uncertain. Thomas took a step closer, his voice low but seething with restrained anger. You were planning to turn everything over to the authorities. You knew things had gone too far. You knew we couldn't come out clean, so you tried to back out and take us down with you. Then the accident happened. Coincidence? I'm not sure. Suddenly, flashes of memory began to surface. Tense meetings, hushed conversations, secrets being discussed. Luke saw himself sitting with Thomas and other men, negotiating shady deals involving large sums of money. He had been on the brink of making a fatal decision to expose everything to the police in exchange for immunity. The accident was starting to feel less and less accidental. Luke tried to speak, but his throat was dry. I didn't know. Didn't know? Thomas snapped, exasperated. You've always been calculating, Lucas. Every move you made was deliberate. I warned you the consequences would be severe. It wasn't just us involved in this. More powerful people you can't even imagine. Don't let anyone walk away unscathed. Fear gripped Lucas, a cold wave that paralyzed him. He was entangled in something far greater than ordinary business dealings. There was a network of corruption, and he had tried to escape it. The accident now seemed like an attempt to silence him. Why are you telling me this now? Luke asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Thomas sighed, his anger giving way to something closer to frustration. Because even if you've lost your memory, they haven't forgotten. And if you go to the police like you planned before, you won't live long enough to see what happens next. If I were you, I'd leave the city. Quickly, Luke stood there, motionless, feeling the weight of everything he had just uncovered. The revelation was crushing. He had tried to escape who he was before the accident, but his past was determined to drag him back. Now, he understood that the choice before him was far more dangerous than he had imagined. Leaving the building, Thomas's words still echoed in Lucas's mind. The shock of the revelation made his legs tremble, as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. The idea that his accident wasn't a coincidence hit him with full force. He had been the target of an attempted murder, and while Thomas had tried to obscure the truth, the evidence was now undeniable. The day was gray, mirroring the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. He wandered the city streets, trying to process what to do next. Fleeing seemed like the only viable option. But where? And for how long? When he returned home, Emma was waiting in the living room, her expression filled with worry. She noticed the tension in Lucas's face and immediately stood, moving closer to him. "Where were you?" she asked softly, though her voice carried a hint of anxiety. Luke looked at her, feeling the weight of the decision he needed to make. He wanted to protect her, but he knew that doing so would require sharing part of the truth. Not all of it. He couldn't involve Emma in this level of danger. Yet leaving without any explanation would also be cruel. She deserved at least some clarity. "We need to talk," Luke said, his voice hoarse. Emma nodded, clearly apprehensive, and they sat on the couch. He began speaking cautiously, choosing his words carefully to avoid revealing more than necessary. Before the accident, I was involved in dangerous business. Things I don't fully remember, but I know they were risky. And now, everything I've discovered leads me to believe that the accident wasn't an accident. Luke looked directly into Mariana's eyes. Someone tried to kill me, and if I stay here, it'll happen again. Emma remained silent for a few seconds, processing his words. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her voice was barely a whisper. "And what are you going to do?" Luke sighed, looking down at the floor. He knew the answer, but saying it aloud made it all the more real and painful. "I have to leave," he said. "Run." Emma slowly shook her head, as if she had already expected that answer, but it didn't make the decision any less heartbreaking. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, her voice laced with a sliver of hope. Luke hesitated. Part of him wanted to say yes, to take her somewhere safe. But he knew that doing so would only put her in danger. If she stayed with him, the same risks he faced would follow her. "I can't ask you to do that," he said, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I can't put you in that kind of danger. I've done bad things, Mariana, and now I have to face them alone." Tears finally spilled from Mariana's eyes, and she stepped away, now standing, looking at him with a mix of sadness and acceptance. There was so much left unsaid between them, but the words wouldn't come. The distance between them, present since the accident, now seemed insurmountable. "I understand," she said at last, "but you need to know. I still love you, Lucas. Even if you don't remember who you were before, I love the man you're becoming now." Her declaration broke Lucas's heart. He stood, moved closer, and embraced her, feeling the pain of losing her even though he knew it was necessary. "I love you too," he whispered. "That's why I have to go." The air was heavy as Luke left the house for the last time. His heart ached as he silently said goodbye to Mariana. The sound of the door closing behind him was the final echo of a life he would never have again. But something larger was at stake, and Luke knew there was no turning back. His next destination was inevitable. He would have to confront Thomas again, and this time, without the uncertainty that had clouded their first meeting. He knew now what Thomas represented. More importantly, he knew what needed to be done. Luke spent the next day gathering all the evidence he had discovered, the letters, the emails, the contracts. It was an enormous risk, but the only way to break the cycle was to expose everything. He knew that exposing Thomas and the others involved could seal his fate, but the weight of the truth was too much to carry alone. With each document he read, each encrypted email he deciphered, Luke felt the gravity of the situation. He was up against powerful people, and one misstep could cost him his life. Finally, Luke decided he couldn't wait any longer. He called Thomas to arrange one last meeting. This time, Luke would dictate the terms. They would meet in the same office where they had spoken before, but the tone of the conversation would be very different. Luke knew Thomas wouldn't come alone, and neither would he. Arriving at the building, Luke couldn't suppress the wave of tension that coursed through him. There was a very real chance this was a trap, but the alternative, continuing to run and live in fear, was no longer an option. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the third floor, his heart racing faster with every second. When the elevator doors opened, Thomas was already waiting, flanked by two men. The office was silent, the tension almost tangible. Luke walked in with steady steps, keeping his composure despite the anxiety simmering within him. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," Thomas said, breaking the silence with an ironic smile. "I'm just not sure if it's bravery or stupidity that makes you think you can walk away from this." "I'm not here to negotiate, Thomas," Luke replied, locking eyes with him. "I know what happened before the accident. I know what we were doing, and I'm done living in its shadow." Thomas laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed in the room. "You think you can just blow this wide open and walk away unscathed? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Luke took a deep breath and pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. Inside it were the pieces of evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the last few days. He tossed it onto the table, and Thomas looked at it with disdain. "You think you're the only one with something to lose here?" Thomas asked, leaning over the table, his eyes burning with anger. "If you expose this, you won't last a day." "Maybe," Luke admitted, his tone resolute. "But if I don't, I won't last much longer either. And just so you know, this evidence is already with someone who will hand it over to the authorities if anything happens to me." Thomas fell silent for a moment, his once threatening gaze now calculating. He knew Luke wasn't bluffing. The men beside Thomas tensed, awaiting his orders. "Why don't you just disappear?" Thomas suggested, his tone softer, almost conciliatory. "You want a fresh start? I'll give you a chance. Take Emma and go far away. Forget this ever happened. I can make sure no one comes looking for you." Luke shook his head. "I've heard that offer before. I can't run anymore, Thomas. I have to do this, even if it costs me everything." Thomas exhaled deeply, and for a fleeting moment, Luke thought he saw something different in his eyes, a shadow of regret, perhaps. But this was a losing battle, and both of them knew it. The silence in the office stretched, Thomas's men visibly on edge as they awaited his command. Luke could feel the moment of decision approaching. "If you go through with this," Thomas finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "we're both dead. You know that, don't you?" Luke nodded, though fear gnawed at him. He knew it was true. There was no happy ending in sight. Still, he stood firm. "If I die for this, at least I'll die doing the right thing." Thomas looked at him with a mix of respect and disdain. He knew he couldn't hold Luke back any longer, but there was still one last chance to sway him. "Fine, Lucas," he said, leaning back. "Have it your way. But I hope you're ready for what's coming next." A few days had passed since Lucas's confrontation with Thomas, and his life had changed irreversibly. After turning over the evidence to the authorities, Luke knew the danger was far from over. The network of people involved was too powerful to be dismantled easily, but he also knew he could no longer live in the shadows. Facing the truth, as painful as it was, had become his only viable choice. Luke was now in a distant city, hundreds of miles from his old life. The people who knew him, including Mariana, were far away, and he understood the necessity of that distance. With every step, he felt the weight of what he had left behind, a life he could never fully remember, but one that had shaped him in ways he couldn't ignore. Sitting in a small cafe on a quiet corner, Luke watched the bustling street outside. The city, though unfamiliar, carried an air of new beginnings. In his hands, he held a newspaper detailing the investigations that had begun to unravel Thomas's organization. Authorities were already dismantling parts of the network, but Luke knew this was only the beginning. He had taken the necessary precautions to ensure his safety. The evidence he handed over was only a fraction of what he had uncovered, and some crucial information was in secure hands, ready to be released if anything happened to him. Yet, the feeling of always being watched, always at risk, lingered. It was a weight he would have to bear for the rest of his life. Luke gazed into the horizon, his mind drifting between fragmented memories and uncertain plans for the future. He thought about Emma often. The pain of leaving her was something he still couldn't fully process. He knew it had been necessary, but that didn't make the loss any less real. She deserved a life free from fear, unburdened by the ghosts that haunted him. With a sigh, Luke stood and left the cafe, walking through the city streets. The constant movement around him felt strangely peaceful in its anonymity. No one here knew who he was, what he had done, or the difficult choices he had faced. It was a bitter freedom, but one he was willing to accept. He found a bench in the park and sat down, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. The emotional scars were still fresh, but there was a certain relief in knowing that, for the first time, he wasn't running. Luke had chosen his path, and even though it was a solitary one, it was a path shaped by his own will. The peace he sought, however, still felt out of reach. The price he had paid was steep, and the future remained uncertain. Yet, despite it all, he felt there was something more, something beyond the pain and fear. There was a chance to rebuild, a chance to become someone different, someone no longer at the mercy of past mistakes. Luke knew this new beginning wouldn't be easy. The wounds he carried wouldn't heal quickly, and he would likely never forget what he had left behind. But in that moment, he was willing to try. The man who had emerged from the accident was not the same one who had made the choices that led him here, and that was something he took pride in, despite everything. He looked up at the sky, feeling the cold wind against his face, and allowed that sense of possibility to fill him. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Luke didn't feel the crushing weight of emptiness. He understood that, while the future was uncertain, he now had control over his own decisions, and that alone was a victory. Standing up from the bench, Luke began walking again. His steps were firm but carried a newfound lightness, as though the burden he had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was ready to face whatever came his way, secure in the knowledge that he was in control of his own life. His past might still haunt him, and the risks hadn't completely vanished, but Luke had found something that gave him strength, the freedom to become someone new, someone he chose to be. And in that moment, that was enough. Torn Memories is a story about loss, reconciliation, and the search for a new identity. Throughout the narrative, Luke discovers that while memory is a powerful connection to the past, it doesn't always define who we are or what we can become. His journey is marked by the choice to face painful truths rather than run from them, accepting the consequences of his mistakes to ultimately build a better future. Despite the scars left by his past, Luke finds strength in the possibility of starting over, reminding us that even in the face of the greatest adversities, there's always a chance to reinvent ourselves. If you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotion, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other incredible narratives like this one. Stay tuned and discover how stories of resilience, love, and forgiveness can inspire change in our own lives.